We are now going to take a look at some of the painting operations and also the ecosystem selector and improve the scene a little bit further, and also instead of just using the automatic population, be able to kind of customize the scene a little bit more to what we want it to look like. So I want to start out by mentioning that there are two different types of ecosystems. The global ecosystem, which is tied to the main ecosystem painter, and also a material-based, which is tied to the object's material. Now we can access the painter in either of these different types of ecosystems, whether we're painting for the global ecosystem or working with the material ecosystem. We can still open up that ecosystem painter. We can see all of the current population for the dead leaves. So if we wanted to add more, we can easily brush in additional leaves into the scene, adjusting the flow and the radius of the brush, and you can of course paint in any of the different viewports, so it's not just perspective or top. It doesn't really matter which one you're in. You can define the direction from the surface, and all of these little check marks, or what we can see is an arrow pointing down next to these options. What that is for is to drive with pressure. So if you're using a pressure sensitive tablet, you can choose to drive with pressure, and these options will change depending on the pressure used on the tablet. What I'm going to do is first switch over to the eraser, and what we can do is erase some of the ecosystem in between some of these trees. So we can easily modify this, but I do want to mention that when you're using the painter, either adding different instances or deleting them, anytime you repopulate, all of those changes will be gone. So that's why the global ecosystem can be so important. So one thing I want to show you before we move over to painting something custom in the global ecosystem is using the ecosystem selector. This is located next to the paintbrush, and once we open it, we're going to see little dots everywhere to represent the different instances for everything in the scene. And if you're using dynamic population, this might not work out the best because it is calculated with every render depending on where the camera position is changed to. But we're using a fixed population where we've populated already, and everything is going to stay unless we repopulate or change it over. So the first thing I want to show you is selecting first just this area here, making sure we're selecting this larger tree in the front, because it is one of those older maple trees, and the quality just, I don't think, is high enough for how close we are to it. So I'm going to select all of the instances around the tree, including the tree, because I'm not sure exactly which one is just the tree. And if we go to manipulate, what we can do is convert to objects. So if we no longer want to use this as an ecosystem instance, we could directly convert it over to an editable plant object. We can move the instances between different ecosystem layers. So we could move this over to the maple layer, the dead leaves layer. We can also change any instance type to another. So if I wanted everything I've just selected to be the yellow maple tree, it will convert it all over. If I wanted to remove that maple and convert it all over to the dead leaves, I could also do that. But what I'm going to do right now is move the instances to the global ecosystem. So now they are no longer part of the material ecosystem. If we open the ecosystem painter, we're going to see that maple tree and also some of those dead leaves. So what I'm going to do now is delete these leaves and remove them. So what I can do is only selected item and use the eraser to remove each instance type individually by painting. or I can just remove them entirely from the global ecosystem. So now when I go back to the ecosystem selector, I'll be able to, or should be able to, select this tree a little easier, because we can see the dot right there. Go to manipulate and convert it to an object. So now we have that red maple tree as an object. And if we want, we can edit it in the plant editor. If we wanted to increase the resolution of just this plant, up at the top we have a ×2 and divide by 2. That really doesn't work that way. It will increase resolution or decrease it. It's not necessarily going to do it by 2. But we can hit the ×2 to increase the resolution. So this will improve the quality of the plant, which will help, since it's a little bit closer to the camera in our scene, and that way we'll end up with a much better looking object. So if we look at a render, we can already see that the resolution is improved, and it does look better than some of the other plants in the scene. So this is a good way to separate some of the objects and maybe increase the resolution of some or others. But in this case, I want to use an entirely different tree. I don't want to just stick with this one. Now, one thing I could do is just delete the tree and add in a new one, but I want to show you another tool that's really helpful. So if I right-click with this maple tree selected, I can use the Replace By. Now we could either keep proportions of the newly imported object, the replacement object, or we can fit it to the existing scale of this object. Well, I'm going to keep the proportions of the loaded object, and what we could do is replace it with a plant, which will allow us to load in a plant. Another option is if we edit the object, what we can do is load in a different plant species. So there are different ways of doing it. If you're working with a plant, sometimes it's easier just to load in a new species to work with, rather than using the Replace By. But it is a good way to use. Either way, it's going to pretty much perform the same operation, and it's also a good way to go between a previs up to the final scene. You can even replace it with a light if you wanted to. So there's a lot you can do. I'm instead going to edit the object and load new species that way. We're going to choose a tree, and I'm going to choose the autumn white birch. And now we can see this new plant loaded in. Go ahead and click OK. And you can clearly see that the scale between these two different objects is quite different. So what I can do is select the scale and just scale this down. And this will fit into the scene a little bit better. And we can go ahead and rotate it. I do want to note that the gizmo, when in local coordinate mode, may be a lot more sensitive than using the global mode. And that's just something I forgot to mention before, but is really important. So if you're noticing that it's way too sensitive, switch to the global mode. Unfortunately, sometimes you need to use local, so your best chance is really to use the plus and minus keys on the number pad to increase and decrease the size of the gizmo, which should help. So we can go ahead and adjust this to fit into our scene a little better. And we're now going to have a much higher resolution tree, something that's going to look a little bit better for close to the camera. And we can see the overall polygon count is 157,000 polygons. The other one was around 50 to 60. So a big difference there. I can go ahead and increase the resolution since I know we're going to be closer, and that way we're going to end up with something even better looking. And then when we're done, we can go ahead and just click OK and have that new higher res plant in the scene. So let's go ahead and paint some leaves in. We're going to go to the ecosystem, and I'm going to remove that red maple from the population and add in some new plants, where I'm going to go and select those dead leaves once again. And this time, because I didn't move them from the other ecosystem, I do have to add them in. But since they're already loaded into the scene, we don't need to worry about OpenGL renders or anything like that. So I'm going to switch to the brush mode, and I can brush this in. And I'm going to select a bit of everything, which is going to select and paint everything within the list. If I use only selected item, it's just going to do either the dead leaves 2 or 3 or 1, depending on which one is selected. We can also see that that overall color will change. So we can modify the color of each of the instances if needed. But I'm going to do a bit of everything and just paint in here. Now I'm running into a slight performance issue because of all of the other instances being shown, and also because I am recording the screen at the moment. So what I'm going to do is close the painter, go to Options, and change the far plane distance to, let's go ahead and set 50 meters. And maybe we'll bring it down a little bit more. Let's go ahead and do 20 meters. And this should improve the performance if I need to reduce it a little bit more. I could also change the quality and the display of the other ecosystem. So if I select the terrain, go to General, and the quality, I'm going to select None. Go back, and it should hopefully behave a little bit better. Display options of the ecosystem painter and the global ecosystem can also be set. And if you remember too, our scale was slightly different, so I may need to increase the scale. And now we're seeing a lot of these added in. The scale overall might need to be drastically increased. And because I did turn off the limit density, we have 2100 instances all cluttered around right here. So what I can do is clear it, which is going to delete everything from the global ecosystem. Turn that option back on, adjust it a little, and kind of repaint in here and see if I can get something that's going to be a little more manageable. Once again, just having a few issues because of me recording at the same time. I also want to note that you can paint, now that we have this tree as an actual object in the scene, we do have the ability to paint directly on the tree as well. So if we want to have some dead leaves moving up the tree, that's also possible. So I just went ahead and just paused really quick and painted some because of the little bit of a performance issue while I'm recording. So I'm going to go ahead and close the ecosystem painter, and I want to show that now I have a global ecosystem object in the scene. This is a separate object that allows me to scale, rotate, move around everything that is painted. And by having this, it also allows me to use the ecosystem selector and automatically select everything in just the global ecosystem. Another thing too is you can save these selections. So I'm going to go ahead and click Save, and now select None. Select a few other instances where we have a new selection, save that, and now we can select None and go between which selection we'd like to load in. So I can load in that first selection. Now we can see that coming back. Also load in the second one, having both of those. So that's pretty nice. And then if you want to get rid of it, you can discard it and then that's an empty selection subset. So that's kind of a cool way to be able to save out any sort of selections you make. If we go back to the painter, there are other options as well. We can change color and scaling. So if we want to change the color of anything in the scene, let's go ahead and make them brown. We can also adjust the color. And the longer you stay on the object, if the airbrush mode is on, it will scale them up higher. And I may have to show this in another scene because of the way the display is currently showing up. So I'm going to go ahead and increase my far plane distance back where it was before. And I'm also going to enable that preview once again for that ecosystem. And I may have mentioned earlier in the training about the display quality carrying over and affecting every single layer. Well, it turns out that's no longer something that happens. So you can set individual ecosystem layer qualities, and it will show up correctly. That's kind of nice because they must have just recently changed that. For a very long time, it would carry over to the other objects. So we can select the global ecosystem if we wanted to and scale those objects. So if I wanted to reduce the scale or lift it up, there's a lot of manipulations we can do that way. So that's pretty nice to be able to go back and forth and work that way. So now we can see with the rendered scene that new tree being closer, a lot higher quality, looks a little bit better. Also see the painted leaves around the base of the tree, and also some of them going up the tree. So I just want to do a quick run through now of the ecosystem painting, since this scene is just having performance issues on my end. I do want to be able to show you a little more you can do with it so you can see it a little bit better. So I'm going to go ahead and just save this scene and then create a new scene, and we can look at it a little bit further. I also want to note, so take this opportunity, you can close the scene and have no scenes open. This is useful when you have your own specific default scene. If you go to File and Options, we can set the default scene with any scene that's loaded. So let's go ahead and click New. And now if I go to File Options, any changes we make to the scene, we can now set our own default scene, so it doesn't have to be the same one every single time. Now typically when you go to File New, it's going to ask you to select a sky, and it's not going to use your default scene. So first, if you click Close and then New, it'll start with your default scene. So that's kind of cool. So I'm going to add in just a standard terrain, and then I'm going to load in just grass material. Also apply that to the ground. I might need to move it directly onto the object. And then open up the Ecosystem Painter. I can add in plants. We'll go ahead and do the maple tree, a red one. Add in, select the cherry tree. And then I'm also going to grab from some of the other trees as well, maybe some plants. So we'll add in the grasses and plants. We'll select the rubber plant. Okay, so now we can go over to that brush mode. Ooh, and it looks like I had a little bit of issue here. I'm going to go ahead and clear that. It looks like a small scale problem. I'm going to go ahead and change the limit density all the way up and take the brush flow and reduce it. Go ahead and clear that out. reduce the limit density, and just seems to be a small problem at the moment. Go ahead and switch over to a different view so we can paint in the top view. And it looks like those performance problems really are directly related to the perspective view. So we'll go ahead and zoom out. We can paint these objects in. Of course, we can control them with driving with pressure. Can adjust the scale, the radius of the brush. Choose to only paint a selected item, so we can now just paint rubber plants or just cherry trees. We can choose to erase only selected items, a bit of everything, which is just everything. And if we have an object selected, we can restrict painting to selected objects as well. So if we go to the brush mode, restrict to selected object, then I'd be able to select the terrain, kind of go back and forth there. The airbrush style is a continuation and will continually populate until you let go. So let's undo that, turn off airbrush, paint, and you're going to see nothing happening until you move the brush. So there are a lot of different ways, and it looks like a little bit of an error there. Undo. I do want to show you the coloring and scaling. Let's go ahead and select red, and this is going to change the color gradually to that selected color. And in this case, it's also scaling upward, and the longer I leave the brush, it's going to continually increase scale and color them more towards that color. So let's go ahead and do green, and now we can make them larger and greener. We can also adjust the rotation. And go into the other viewports, and it looks like rotation may not really work with the coloring and scaling tool. So whether or not it's a bug, I'm not sure. It might be something that's fixed eventually, so you can always go back and give it a try. If we go to the single instance mode, we can click and create individual instances, just one at a time. This is a really nice placement method, especially if you're having problems in painting in the perspective view, but you do want to see from the perspective view to place initial objects. Go back to the coloring and scaling. We can reduce the scale, and now it's going to shrink these objects. Of course, that can all be driven with pressure. We can change display options, full quality in your camera if needed, to be able to view that. You can also choose to hide the ecosystem from render. This will hide the entire global ecosystem. You can also turn off individual options. So if we don't want to color these, we just want to scale them, we can just have that option on. Or if we just want to color them, we don't want to scale them, same thing, just depending on which item is checked. Go ahead and close this out really quick. And going back to the terrain, I'm going to add an ecosystem layer, open the ecosystem selector, and just select some of these instances, and we can choose to move this to the... Oh, it looks like because there is nothing populated on that material ecosystem, I'm going to go ahead and add in just that rubber plant. Turn off dynamic population, which might have been it as well. Go back to the selector, and we can move the instances now to that material-based ecosystem. So I'm going to check and see the title. And we're going to go ahead and give this ecosystem a name. Just call it Terrain Eco. And now back to the selector, and we can move the instances to that Terrain Eco. Now they are no longer part of the global ecosystem, they are part of the terrain ecosystem. And we'll see the objects have been added, and also the instances showing here. And it looks like it did reset some of the display. We just refresh that. We can also go into the Ecosystem Painter, add in a rock object. It's going to ask us if we want to have color variations. I'm going to select yes. It's going to automatically create some color variations for these rocks. So we can go ahead and paint a bunch of rocks into the scene. Only selected item to just paint the rocks. And which will add a whole bunch into the scene. And then I'm going to use the coloring and scaling, just set scale, and increase the size, really make them a lot larger. Some of those are going to be huge. And now we can see that rock object showing up in the distance. And now see all the rocks showing up. So there's a lot of different things we could do with it. And if you're having problems in the perspective view, just use another viewport. The top view is the original implementation of the Ecosystem Painter, or the xStream Painter if you're using the integrated version of xStream. So sometimes the perspective view has been kind of on or off, really depending on which bugs are being worked on. And of course it will paint on any objects you have. As you saw before, it was painting onto the terrain. If you're using xStream integrated, it'll paint on the objects within your host application. So it's still a very powerful part of the program. A lot you can do with it to really define and have more control over ecosystem painting and where ecosystems go, rather than just a random density amount or just using images or anything else to control the overall density of an ecosystem.